Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Well, I'm so excited to be here and talk about one of my favorite subjects. I think it's probably very near and dear to everyone's heart here. My name is Sonia Beschenheim. I am a media and First Amendment lawyer at the law firm of Ballard Spahr in New York City. And I spend my days defending journalists from defamation lawsuits. I help them get access to public records. I help them bulletproof their stories before publication, with reviewing them for legal risk. And before I was a lawyer, I was a journalist. I spent most of my time at the Wall Street Journal, where I wrote about financial markets based in New York City, and then also in Hong Kong. So I love the work, I love that I'm still connected to journalism, and I will hand it over to my next panelist.
Hi, everybody. My name is Skye Perryman. I am a lawyer and serve as the president and CEO of Democracy Forward. We are a national legal organization that is committed to using the courts to advance progress and democracy. Both of those things are under a lot of attack right now. Our team, along with several others, is currently challenging the administration's attempts to decimate the Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, the Broadcasting Network, and representing a whole host of people, communities, and institutions in a range of First Amendment and related litigation against the federal government.
Hi everyone, thank you, and it's great to be here this afternoon. I'm Anna Johnson. I'm the bureau chief for the Associated Press here in Washington. I've been at the AP for a long time. I never thought I'd be at one news organization for so long, but it is a great news organization to work for, and I've been very fortunate to have lots of wonderful opportunities there. Prior to coming to Washington, I worked in London and was the news director for Europe and Africa. I also spent a lot of time in the United States as a journalist, out west in Phoenix I was based in Chicago, and as well also in the Middle East. So I was based in Cairo for several years too. So I've gone back and forth quite a bit in my journalism career between being a journalist in the United States and being a journalist outside of the United States.
So before we get to our wonderful panelists, I thought I would start by providing an overview of a few of the ways press freedoms are currently under attack under this administration. So, we're seeing things like the FCC exercising merger approval as a cudgel, and you think about the Paramount merger with Skydance, and really using merger approval as a way to influence the content of CBS's speech. We're seeing executive orders that target journalists for the type of language they use. I'm thinking of the Gulf of America, or Gulf of Mexico, as it is called. We're seeing executive orders that dismantle entire agencies that fund media outlets, like the Voice of America. And we're also seeing a rise in defamation lawsuits. Now, this is not new, but I think what's remarkable here is we're seeing defamation lawsuits being brought by the sitting president of the United States. I'm thinking of the Wall Street Journal lawsuit. So, against this backdrop, I wanted to dive into two of those topics based on our experienced panelists here. So, Skye, I want to talk a little bit about the Voice of America lawsuit. Can you just set the scene for us? Why did this executive order jump out at you, and why did you decide to bring this lawsuit?
Well, certainly it is one of a number of executive orders and executive actions that we have seen that are both seeking to harm the ability of people to express themselves and to take in real information. There are obvious national security concerns and human rights concerns with the decimation or the attempt to decimate the Voice of America in particular, given the role that it has played for so long. And then there were just a range of things that the president was seeking to do with both the Voice of America as well as a number of other of the agencies and institutions that are just very unlawful. And I think that the White House initially thought that the legal community was not going to be able to respond, that he could bully, he could bully institutions into not wanting to sue, he could bully law firms into capitulating and not wanting to bring cases. And so it was really important to us to show that there was a strong response and that there would be a strong legal response and that there was pushback, and to use it as a way of, hopefully being able to preserve the important work that journalists do through Voice of America and other outlets, but also to be able to expose to the American people and to the world the extremism in the administration.
And can you actually just step back and explain what Voice of America is and sort of what the practical effect of the executive order would be?
Well, the president also, and I say this in a non-political way, I mean, he has sort of very petty, ambitions at times that they can have really big implications. And so one of the things that happened early on was the administration sought to decimate the USAID, which has been doing. We brought a lawsuit against that decimation, and I said that the decimation of USAID threatens Americans at home and abroad. And one of the journalists from Voice of America, and the leader of Voice of America, retweeted that, and that is actually what led the president on this rampage against Voice of America. But obviously, Voice of America has been incredibly important, as well as Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting Network, Radio Free Europe, in providing journalistic information, facts, and evidence across the world for communities, including communities and countries and regions where press freedom has been threatened. And so, the role of Radio Free Asia as one example in the days that followed the Tiananmen Square incident in China is one example of the importance of those outlets, and they have, of course, been supported by the federal government.
And I'll just note, the Radio Free Asia reporters, they're here too, so I was I don't necessarily in the room, they might be, but like in the US too.
Yes.
I was watching a part of a criminal trial, and there were reporters in the room, asking questions and thinking about things amongst themselves, and it was great to see. So going back to the Voice of America lawsuit, I'm going to use that. I know you have a couple, but I'm going to use that as the illustrated. Yeah. So can you explain to us, why does that executive order that you're tackling here, why does it violate the First Amendment?
Well, so there are a range of laws that it violates, and actually what the court has been looking at is some other laws. But I'll talk about the threats to the First Amendment. The government cannot condition its support for recipients of federal funds, for recipients of federal grants, on a submission or a assimilation to a particular ideological view, right? If the freedom of speech and the freedom of press means anything, it is that there can actually be freedom in what is communicated. And the administration has sought in many instances, and it's not just with respect to Voice of America and with respect to press freedom. We've seen it. They sought to withhold funds from the American Bar Association, my professional association as a lawyer, as a result of the American Bar Association's inconvenient information that it put out about the responsibility of all lawyers to follow the Constitution. So we're seeing this theme throughout the administration, these actions throughout the administration, but the conditioning of federal funds or federal support on submission to a particular ideology is largely a violation of the First Amendment. As you know, there are certain nuances to that. But I think at its base, that is one of the main things that we want people to understand about the importance of this suit, about the importance of what is happening in the United States, is that you have the President of the United States essentially seeking to control how people express themselves and using the power of the federal government to control that. And that is not something, for which there is support in our Constitution.
And before I go to Anna, I do want to ask the room here, does anyone have experience with media lawyers, First Amendment lawyers? Has anyone, great, hopefully positive experiences, but has anyone had the unfortunate experience of being sued for their reporting? Okay, so with that, we're going to go to Anna and the Associated Press. So this is another example of an executive order. It was one of the first executive orders. And this executive order essentially directed the government to use the term Gulf of America instead of Gulf of Mexico. What happened next? What happened in your newsroom? How did you think about what term to use, and then what happened to your reporters?
Sure, so after that executive order, which did not directly target any journalist or anyone, it was just an executive order renaming a body of water, as well as Denali to Mount McKinley was in the same. We're a global news agency. We have our readers, our customers are everywhere around the world. And we, of course, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, have something called the AP Style Book, which is where, we have from everything from how you should spell a state and how you should do height and numbers to what where you might call something, what the name is, what sort of thing. So after this happened, we had a number of customers who were asking us what were you going to do? And as a global news agency, we seek to, in the language that we use and how we describe things, to have the widest understanding of what we are trying to convey. So obviously we decided we did an update to our style book that said that it's pretty straightforward, that the AP would continue to use the Gulf of Mexico, but when it made sense and when it was relevant, we would also refer to it as the Gulf of America. The same update also said, though, because the President of the United States has the authority to rename something within the boundaries of the United States, we would now refer to Mount McKinley, or Denali as Mount McKinley. So that was it, we put it, that was it, we, moved on, sort of, I don't know, a couple weeks went by, nothing, we never heard any, no one had come to us from the administration to say anything or to voice displeasure over that. And then one day at the White House, we were informed that our team was not going to be allowed into an Oval Office event with the president. I don't know how familiar everyone is here. I'm sure some are more familiar than others of what the press pool is and how this works at the White House. But the AP has been a standing member of the wire part of the press pool and has been part of the press pool for both text and photos. We're also there for radio since the founding. We are there not just to cover it for the Associated Press, we're there as the eyes and ears of people everywhere, news organizations everywhere, because we are a news agency. And so our customers are from the many, newspapers, radio stations, TV stations, all across the United States and all around the world. And so we were informed that we were no longer being allowed in because of our decision not to call it the Gulf of America. It took us very much by surprise. We had no idea that the administration was upset that we had put this out there. And so this continued a couple days later, or next day or 2 days later, our photographers were also not allowed in for the same thing. We're not allowed in Air Force One, which we had always traditionally had traveled with the president anywhere the president went in the United States and around the world. The AP for text and photos had always gone with. We try to, I'll just, we try to resolve this. No one wants to file a lawsuit against the government in any fashion. That is the last resort. And we did try to resolve this in a way that would work. But it became very clear that the only resolution within the administration's mind was that we would have to call it the Gulf of America. There was no other path forward.
In other words, you have to change
our speech.
Yeah, your speech. Yeah.
We'd have to change our speech. And obviously, we could not do that. That is just, not just for the AP, but we couldn't do that on behalf of all other media organizations and on behalf of the American people. That you cannot be retaliated against because of the speech that you use. And so we felt, there was no path forward, and as a result, we, decided we needed to sue 3 White House officials, and that is what happened after that. It's gone on a long journey since then, but that is sort of how it all came to be earlier this year.
And actually, my colleagues at Ballard Spahr, including Chuck Tobin, who's in the room, brought that lawsuit on behalf of the AP, and you decided to sue for violations of the Fifth Amendment, for due process, and for violations of the First Amendment. And like you said, it's been sort of a long and winding road. But can you talk to us a little bit about how conditions have changed for you, if at all?
Sure.
And I know they've varied over time.
Yeah, so initially in that first lead up, we were not allowed in to cover nearly all events involving the president for both our photographers and our writers as well. We went to court. We had a judge, Judge McFadden, who was a Trump-appointed judge here in federal court in DC, and we were granted a preliminary injunction with a very strong, and I would recommend anyone who has not read this ruling by Judge McFadden to spend some time. It is an emphatic support of the First Amendment. That's what the ruling was, largely based on, and it really is. It is a strong, just incredible support for the First Amendment and how the President of the United States cannot do this, cannot retaliate against media, but essentially the American people, for this language that they choose to use. After that, the White House made some changes to comply to some degree with the ruling. And that's sort of where we are now, and I'll mention one other thing within a legal standpoint, but where they changed the makeup. So what ended up happening is they essentially changed the makeup of the press pool, because we were the ones being systematically excluded. Instead, what they decided to do, instead of letting us back in for both text and photos and everything, they just changed the makeup. And I know there's our colleagues, people from Bloomberg and Reuters, they dismantled the wire pool, which was the AP, Reuters, and Bloomberg all the time were allowed in for text. That was a wire pool. They got rid of that. They took over the text pool. They are now running the text pool. And so we have, I'd say, rare occasional access to cover events for our text journalists. For the photo pool, they put it back to what it was prior. And our photographers do cover, we also are part of the radio pool too, so we are occasionally in for radio. I will just say, just quickly, when obviously they appealed, the appeals court had ultimately put a stay in place, so they actually stayed Judge McFadden's ruling, and we're right now in the appeals process, so we're in the slog of it, I would say. Like, we're in this long slog where, maybe by the end of the year, I should actually say this, but maybe by the end of the year we'll have arguments in that. I mean, we're really in this, it was things sped up, moved quickly at the end of the year, and now we're sort of in the long slog, which happens during, legal proceedings like this.
Yeah, and lawsuits are sometimes the only option, but the legal process isn't fast. And so things get appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so it's a good thing to keep in mind is that lawsuits are a very powerful tool and sometimes the only way you can vindicate your rights, but it's not a quick solution. And I would just say,
the Judge McFadden opinion was such an excellent opinion, and congrats to the lawyers involved. The Voice of America cases and so Judge McFadden was appointed by President Trump. The Voice of America cases are before Judge Lamberth, who was a Reagan appointee, and who has also had a number of sort of choice things to say about the way the government is handling, a variety of the issues surrounding Voice of America, and who recently required that Carrie Lake appear for a deposition, which will happen later this month. So, to the extent that there is a misimpression that these cases are somehow political or, somehow in courts that you have a judge that you know who you're going to get and you know what kind of ruling you're going to get. That is not what we're seeing across the board with the federal accountability litigation. It's certainly not what we have in these media cases.
and I think that's a great point, Skye. Like, the First Amendment historically has not been a Democratic or Republican issue. It's just been a core value of this country. And it's become politicized more recently, but that shouldn't be the case, I think. I think, you see outlets that characterize themselves as conservative and more liberal suing to vindicate their rights. You see nonprofit organizations from all parts of the spectrum also suing to vindicate the rights of journalists and speakers of all types. And I think it's a really important point to make. This is not a political thing. Skye, I was wondering if, sorry to startle you. I was wondering if you might opine a little bit on some of the other media outlets that have been affected. We've seen outlets like PBS and NPR when we're talking about congressional funding of these outlets. Would you mind just kind of like taking us a spin through those situations and maybe drawing parallels to what else you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that the administration is seeking to do across the board is to weaponize the power of the federal government and the power the federal government has with respect to grants or funding that it may provide. Much of that federal funding, whether it is federal funding for community programs you all are familiar with, such as Meals on Wheels or other types of very, very hyper-local programs, or funding for larger, larger institutions such as PBS or NPR. There is a range of that funding that has been specifically appropriated by Congress, where the president doesn't really have the power to, under our Constitution, to impound those funds. So that's been part of the dispute, is this power struggle that the president has made up, because the Constitution and federal law are quite clear, but this power struggle between the president and Congress. And there have been other instances where there is funding that is provided to federal agencies as part of particularized programs, and the agencies themselves sort of have made decisions about how to run federal programs where at the federal agency level, funding is being arbitrarily, or maybe not arbitrarily, but sort of capriciously utilized as a tool of intimidation, as a tool to try to get folks to submit. So that's what you, for instance, see in the ABA case that I mentioned, was the Department of Justice wanting to cut off, the ABA's federal funding to support survivors of domestic violence and lawyers to learn how to serve those communities because it was mad at the ABA. We have seen that also occur with respect to funding streams, and I'll start with some of the smaller ones first. Funding streams that certain agencies across the federal government may support community programs that support local journalism and community journalism in some way, whether those are through nonprofit organizations or community organizations. I do want to highlight sort of the local effects of this. And then you see that with respect to NPR and PBS. And so one of the things that we're trying to make sure that people see is, sometimes when these things are covered, it's covered as the Voice of America dispute, or it's covered as the NPR dispute. And in some ways there is nuance, right? Like the laws that are involved and the legal arguments that are involved in all of these cases are not the same. And the challenges that the clients have are not the same. But if you take it up one notch, what you see is a highly concerning pattern by this administration to dismantle and discredit any type of check on the administration. And by check, I don't mean necessarily people that disagree with the administration, it's just people that are exposing what is going on. And so we've seen that with the attacks on journalism through funding, we've seen that with the attacks on lawyers, we've seen that with the attacks on education. We are largely winning most of these suits, but that has not stopped a lot of the harm that's happening, in part because of something that was referred to. A lot of the appellate courts are, at least staying the injunction, saying we're not going to say what the president did or what the government did was necessarily legal, but we're going to let it sort of proceed while the legal process plays out.
And when you say staying, just for the non-
Yeah, so they essentially say we're not saying that we're not going to determine this yet on the merits, or even on the merits of preliminary motions, but we're going to say that the injunction can be lifted essentially for a period of time, stayed, paused, where the federal government can do what it wants to do. So that is what has happened in the Voice of America case, for instance, as many of you know that have colleagues that work that have either worked for Voice of America or related entities. There has been a stay on some of the terminations of people, while there's also a court order in place that says that the agency cannot be fully decimated and has to fulfill its purpose, which is what we're currently embroiled in a fight over, and what Carrie Lake will be deposed over later this month.
And then the law about agencies, and it is like you used arbitrary and capricious earlier. There's a lot of legal terminology here, but at core, I think your lawsuit is really getting at this idea that the administration can't target speech.
It can't target speech, and it can't act, and we know what it means. It cannot act in an arbitrary fashion, and it can't act in a capricious fashion, and it also can't target speech.
This brings me to my next point, actually. I want to talk about press freedom more broadly. So we've been focused on the United States. We're here. The U.S. has a First Amendment. That's not the case in other countries. So I wanted to ask both of you a couple questions about your experiences, either studying the state of press freedom globally or with your experience as a journalist abroad. So Skye, first, can you tell us a little bit what happens or what you've observed when foreign governments restrict press freedom.
Well, we know that press freedom is not a talking point, it's not trite. Press freedom is like a huge and a incredible foundation of the freedom of people to be able to live in free societies. So that's just, that is what it is. So when you look globally, it is not a mistake that as democracies backslide, which we are in the midst of not only a backslide in the United States, and that backslide did not start on Inauguration Day. International researchers believe that it started, sometime before 2021, and it was officially recognized in 2021 when the United States was added to the list of global backsliding democracies. And overall, in our world, more countries are backsliding than democratizing right now. And when you look across the board at what is happening in those societies, you find that one of the first things to go, or one of the first things that the governments seek to control is the press, and is the ability of people to obtain information about what is happening to them and to their communities. And so when we say what is local is global, we mean that in all the ways, right? The attacks on your local journalism, the attacks on our journalistic infrastructure in the United States have, also speak to the broader attacks that we're seeing globally.
And Anna, can you give us some perspective from your time abroad? I think you were in London right before you came back to DC, right? And you also mentioned you were in the Middle East before that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I often think, in my jobs, both working in the Middle East, but then also I was a news manager who oversaw all of our reporters throughout Europe and Africa. And obviously that's a wide range of different countries and different stories, but also a wide range of, from democracies to very authoritarian countries as well. And I think, we continue, so other news organizations, our job is to report the news, and we do what we need to do to protect the journalists that we need to cover that news. And so, in some places that is obviously really hard to do. I mean, we manage it, we figure out ways to cover it, but it is not easy, and our journalists are, face threats that, are really, really difficult, and have, caused them to have to upend their lives, and, have been, in some circumstances, they've been jailed. There have been, you think about this every time when you're doing the reporting and you're putting out coverage, and what can we do as a news organization to protect our journalists? And I think, I'll say this. I mean, one of the other things I think that through this whole, with the Gulf of Mexico and the pressure that we had as the AP to change our language, another factor that went into this was this idea that had we done that, not only would that be incredibly problematic for us changing our speech based on pressure from the government in terms of other journalists covering the government, Americans everywhere, that the pressure to not be able to, the First Amendment, and to have to retaliate for the speech you use. But it would also indicate all around the world where we have journalists, and journalists working in countries with, that are not democracies, that we do get pressure to change the language that we use. Well, if we did it here, how would we ever say that we would be pressured all over the place to change that? And I think, what would we be able to say if we had done it here in the United States, when we're asked frequently to change language, to change words, to change what we call something. And so I think, that was another factor in there, that was just not something we were going to be able to do.
And there's sort of, obviously the First Amendment doesn't exist in every country. It's sort of a very unique thing we have here. What about the practice of journalism abroad versus here? I know, when I reported in Hong Kong for a while, and there's this very common question someone would ask. I was like, oh, can you send me your quotes for approval? I was like, no, I'm not going to send you. You spoke to me on the record. I'm not going to send you, I'm not going to send you quotes. You can clean them up and sound better after the fact. But Anna, did you notice other practices abroad versus here?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So to that point, yes, I mean, I think we're, outside of the United, that is, in the United States, that's not a law, but that is not practice, right? You don't do that. And when you are interviewing people, if you're interviewing someone who, doesn't interact with journalists a lot, it's our responsibility to explain how we do our jobs and what it means to talk to a journalist and what it means when we're going to, air video or, publish in words what someone says. And obviously with public officials, like, they know this, and you're not going to let them change their quotes and give them approval. In other countries, even in democracies, that actually, it's more of the tradition that does happen quite a bit, and we would often get, asked, well, we need to see your questions in advance, or you need to, we don't do that anywhere. So, sometimes that would, us trying to explain sort of, the journalistic values and the journalistic, things that we do at AP in other countries where that isn't necessarily the tradition of other media all of the time. I'll also say this, one of the things in the United States, and I think something that as journalists, but also I hope the American people as well, really truly understand are the laws that we do have in place, like obviously the First Amendment, first and foremost, but other things that we have in place that allow us to access information. I think of FOIA, all of the time. And, this is something, it is not easy. We all know that, it is impossible trying to work governments. They try to push back all the time. They don't want to give you records. They don't want to send you things. But, in just a couple weeks alone, I can rattle off 5 or 6 stories, including the AP's coverage of alligator Alcatraz. We had our coverage, we did the Bureau of Labor Statistics that were based on our ability to get records because of FOIA. And I think that's not something that exists in a lot of countries. The ability to access information, it is about holding governments and powerful people to account. And that is our job as journalists. And so that isn't the case even, in countries that have, robust press and have, more freedoms. They don't always have some of the laws and protections and traditions that we do in the United States. And I think it's something that, through all of this, that it's sort of been more at the forefront of my mind of how we have to continue to first utilize those as much as we can and do journalism and do the work that we need to do here in the United States, and to continue to fight to keep these protections that we have so that we can report on what is going on with governments and with, all across the state government, local government, and of course the federal government to the best that we can. And so I think, to me that was striking also working abroad, is realizing that some of those things just they weren't as widespread, they weren't a guarantee you could do that, there was no path to do that, and how fortunate, and lucky we are in the United States to have that, and that we don't want to lose those protections.
And I'll say, we filed Freedom of Information Act requests a lot.
Yeah. Lots of people do.
And lots of our, journalists that we speak to are saying that because the administration is truly being so, there's just such a lack of transparency. I think you always face that, where there's a lack of transparency, but this is really above and beyond where they've not provided access, that it has been the Freedom of Information Act and some of the lawsuits that we can file to force the release of those records that is helping the public understand, and then of course the journalistic work to cover the results of that, and then also to talk with sources. We filed the first of its kind lawsuit, the first lawsuit against the administration on their cover up of the handling of the Epstein files, right? And so so while Congress is doing whatever it's gonna try to do, and political actors are doing whatever they're trying to do, we have a live lawsuit that has a pretty aggressive schedule in order to obtain communications between what we believe is the White House, the FBI, and the DOJ with respect to the cover-up of whatever is happening with the files. And that's, one example, but the immigration context is another example where we have been able, we have sued to obtain the agreement between the United States and El Salvador, for instance, in addition to the other cases that we have challenging the agreement that the administration entered into. And so I do think FOIA will continue to be so important, and the willingness of the FOIA seekers to go to court to enforce responses to the requests, because we are not seeing that they're timely responding to many of the requests.
Another legal concept here in the United States is something called fair report privilege, and it means that if you are reporting on a publicly filed complaint, for instance, you're protected as long as what you write about is in the complaint, it's a fair and accurate summary of the complaint. And so that's I think that's really another strong protection for journalists here, because lawyers are filing these lawsuits, journalists are trying to protect their rights, and there's an ancillary right that helps journalists write about what's happening on the legal scene. I have more questions for our panelists, but I was wondering if people in the crowd had questions as well. Wonderful.
So we only have 3 mics, so instead of our mic, and you guys can share about the little channel. So who's got Megan, I'm gonna start with you. Just because I saw you first, so.
Thank you for all the work that you all do. I'm just thinking about, maybe this is for Sky, possibly Sonia. You mentioned USAID. I had friends who are now back stateside and no longer obviously work for them. Even though I've lost track of the state of the lawsuits, but let's just say it all goes against the administration. I'm like, it's done. You can't rebuild it. I'm just wondering this because I work for a public radio station. And yeah, I mean, NPR and PBS will suffer because we're not getting the money to buy their programming. And I have a 12% cut to my budget. Maybe eventually in courts that will be ruled wrong, but we'll probably be okay. There's some smaller stations that are not gonna make it. And so you probably don't have an answer, but it's like, if the slow wheels of justice turn the right way, they seem to be counting on that. Like, just go fast, break things, and whatever happens, and it's all right, it's all gone anyway, so.
And that's certainly, their strategy has been to try to take the cases up to the Supreme Court on the emergency docket, which has now been used exponentially, and I have a chart that, we're not doing slides, but that I'm sure you all can find, that just shows it's completely unprecedented in the last 6 months. Totally exceeds what we have ever seen year over year over year, even in the first Trump administration, and so.
Plus they've gone after lawfare, so.
Yeah, but I mean, the cases are winning, and they're winning before Trump appointed judges, and they're winning before Republican appointed judges, and they're winning before Democratic appointed judges, and what's happening is that in instances where the administration wants to aggressively pursue an agenda, they're seeking these quote stays of these injunctions, which a lot of harm is done while the lawsuit is pending.
And just to unpack that for the non-lawyers, if a district judge, can I do my voice part?
Sure.
If the district judge says, this is unconstitutional, and they might enjoin it to pause that unconstitutional thing from happening, like Sky was saying, the appeals court might lift that stay and so say, no, this thing can keep happening even if it maybe is unconstitutional. So the idea that the harm can continue while the litigation is occurring.
So then that, by the way, is what's happened with our case successfully, the Department of Education, decimation of the federal workforce. So what I can say on that is a few things, because one is there are things that you can do. As facts change, sometimes you can try to relitigate those stays. I don't know that we think that, it'll be interesting to see if that is successful, but we are aggressively pursuing these cases even after the stays. And what the media is doing is reporting all of those facts that are coming out, which is creating public pressure. And so I'll just, one thing, because people are always looking for hope, but we have a lot of examples of this, that after we won a court order preventing the decimation of the Department of Education, and the Supreme Court, without explanation, allowed that decimation to continue to occur, even though it has not found that the administration is acting lawfully, which is what we call the stay, we filed another lawsuit against the president's impoundment of over $6 billion of education funding that would have wrecked public school budgets starting this month. And because of the pressure of that litigation and the public outcry, as a result of the harms that were happening both with the decimation of the Department of Education, the government fully released those funds. And we see that is like part of what we do every day. And so, that's the other piece, is that a part of this is a volume exercise, and we have to just keep pushing, and the reporters have to keep reporting, and the lawyers have to keep litigating, and the communities have to keep pushing, because we are seeing some of those changes. So the harms are great.
Are you guys doing that for the CPE fund?
For the what?
CPE, Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
They have great lawyers that are doing it.
And I'll just connect one thing on the journalism side of this, is that there are so many legal challenges and so much happening in the courts, and at the AP and other news organizations, we're doing our very best to report on all of these. And importantly though, put them in context and try to connect the dots, and they tend to happen late at night, and sometimes late at night, like 6 lawsuits happen, rulings happen, and then we have a tracker where you can go in and you can track every single one, and it's by topic, and you can kind of see where it's at. It is a lot, But that is partly our job is, to help guide and connect the dots as best as we can to say, this is happening and this is interesting. These 5 or 6 lawsuits have gone this way, or this is where it's at. We've done a lot about the emergency appeal to the Supreme Court and how unusual that is and how many there are. And so I just, just as journalists, it is also our job, it is a challenge because there's a lot. But we're doing our very best, I think, to try to, for people, for readers and for everyone around the country and around the world to understand what's happening.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hang on, we have a lot of questions. We're gonna go to the agenda. We're gonna do our best to get the mic to people as fast as we can.
I think this question is mostly for Anna, but for the rest of you as well, I guess. So I am a journalism professor and independent journalist writing a book and have had reason to interact with the FBI. And so I have requested some information from the FBI on documents on a documentary they put out. I've asked, I want to interview some former FBI directors, assistant directors and stuff. And the amount that they are requesting from me, so they say that even to interview someone who is retired who may be consulting with them, I'm supposed to submit all of my questions in advance. They wanted to know, have a complete outline and summary of my book. They wanted to know every single person I have interviewed for it. They told me after many weeks that they have vetted and approved my book, so they can participate. So they have approved an interview with a retired FBI agent. They want to supervise that interview. They want me to submit all my questions in advance, and they told me I cannot record the interview in any way. I don't know if this is just independent journalist, professor writing a book they can, push back. But are they doing this to the AP every time you ask something from the press office of the FBI or other parts of DOJ? Because I pushed back and said, I'm not going to give you all my questions in advance. I'm confused. Are you thinking you're supervising this interview? And I really don't know how to do an interview on this complicated topic on video without being able to record and, so I'm curious what this feeling is working with these press offices, because you brought up FOIA being slow, but FOIA was always slow for the federal government, so we really don't know how much they've stopped. Have they stopped communicating to?
So, I would say, in part, that's probably largely what you're experiencing, and unfortunately, I'm glad you're pushing back because that is key. It's probably not necessarily, depending on the topic, a new thing that they want to. I think this exists in everything. It's our, we're always, there's a lot, the expectations, the wanting all these things, wanting, every, stories are published, and this is across, this is not one party or the other party, it's across parties, across, the Democrats do this as well, the kind of pushback on things that are constantly, that happens, and it happens a lot, and it happens all the time, so I don't know that that is necessarily a new thing. I will say, when in our dealings, of course, reporting on law enforcement, is that, I think it's particularly with the FBI is, we don't frequently have really long sit down on the camera interviews. There are, so I can't speak to your situation exactly, but it is, I will say across, currently across administration, it's a challenge, to obtain information in large, cases, we've seen this, there aren't robust necessarily in every place sort of press operations, they've let go of a lot of press operations in a lot of agencies, or they downsized considerably, or they brought in people that don't necessarily have a lot of experience dealing with the media. So that has been a challenge. And I will give all the credit to our reporters who, are continuing every day to build sources, to understand, to, go around. I always think you got to go around. You can't go just through the front door on these things. You've got to go around. And you've got to find the sourcing, and it's hard work. But certainly kudos to you for pushing back on those. A lot of our requirements there that obviously you can't do and are not practical. And even forget about just they're just not practical. And of course you have to record. You want to be accurate and you want to put it on video. It's just not so practical.
We have time for one more question right up front.
I just wanted to ask, having listened to the conversation, and really anyone can answer, it has been my observation, looking at some of the capitulations that have been made by very large legacy outlets like CBS, like ABC, turning over notes, editing a video, settling lawsuits that involve defamation or accusations of misrepresentation of stories, that most journalists who work for those companies would rather, gouge an eye out, right? Than make those sorts of concessions. But it's not up to them. There's a legal department that is looking at how much time it will take, how much money it will cost, how difficult the administration could make someone's life for not cooperating with them, and advising the people at the top that the politically expedient thing to do is just settle. And I think it is great if you work for an agency that's willing to go to war to keep that from happening. But what do you think, firstly, the impact is of companies who advise their clients in another direction? And what can journalists do if they work for a company whose legal department is saying money is most important, settle, don't?
Let me speak to this because it's something we see across sectors, and also I think Suzanne knows that I used to be a former general counsel. You have to make those calls from that prior thing. One of the challenges that, and I'm not making excuses for anything, I do think there's a lot of ways to push back. But one of the challenges that institutions of higher education, that media outlets, that all sectors are having, is that we are fundamentally in a different paradigm. And their legal teams and their legal advisors have not been able to catch up with that risk association in the paradigm. In a field like journalism, in a field like the law, in a field like higher education, at this point with these types of actors in the White House, and I say this in a non-political way, I say this in a sort of what is happening with democracies overall, the cost of inaction or the cost of capitulation is going to end up being higher for the sector and for the institutions than the cost of taking some type of defensive action. The problem is we're in a rapidly accelerating autocratic nation. That is where we are. We were in a backsliding democracy, according to international researchers, starting in 2021 and remained on that list ever since, even when you had a White House that was ostensibly pro-democracy. Okay, this is now a rapidly accelerating situation and people are feeling it, and that is a new paradigm for America. It is a new paradigm for risk calculation, and the courts are behind on it, and the legal advisors are behind on it, and many corporate boardrooms are behind on it. But if you look at what happened in Europe in the 30s, these sectors did not survive because the cost of inaction was greater than the cost of action, but they were not being advised about the cost of that inaction because there was a rapidly shifting paradigm. And so the problem with the specific legal advisors that are making these things is they don't get to look at the overall sector. They're trying to answer what their clients and in particular circumstances are saying. And so I do think that there is a real moment now, and this is a great gathering and there are other gatherings, that there needs to be sector-wide solutions and sector-wide conversations about how whole sectors are going to respond. And by the way, that's really hard to do in various legal settings too, right? Because depending on the nature of the industry, you can't always just get everybody in the same room and have a conversation. So I'm not suggesting this is a simple thing from a legal risk perspective, but that is what we need. And if you look at what has happened in philanthropy, certain pro-democracy philanthropic organizations did start seeing what was happening with the law firms that were getting picked off and the universities, and there was an effort to get people together to decide what they were going to do. And I'm not defending every decision that every philanthropist has made, but by and large, they put up a very bold fight before the White House and said, if you bring these executive orders calling out our institutions, we are going to sue you, and this is what it's going to look like. And we haven't seen those orders yet. We still may. But I think we've got a long way to go. We've got several years, and that's if everything goes well. I think this should be the early looking at the playbook and then finding out what types of relationships and gatherings can people build, what types of risk sharing can people and sectors engage in. So that would be my response, and I think it's a real need.
And I know we're out of time. I just want to say, I think in the meantime, what you all do is really important, right? Like you are reporting, you're writing about these stories, and so just keep doing that. And we'll help you if you need legal help.